We ready to go? Wayne and Alcoholic, good to be here. Grateful to be sober. I love AA. I want to thank Mike for inviting me to do this. He wanted me to do an 8-session workshop, but we settled on 4. And it is a workshop, but we're not going to do much work. I'm going to do most of the talking. Hopefully you're going to do the listening, and I'll try to listen to myself. You know, at prayer, as I was listening to that prayer, I'm thinking, God, can I even talk today? I hope I'm a little more emotionally stable than I once was. I see a lot of my friends on here, a lot of my sponsees and grand sponsees and great grand sponsees, and some of my Al-Anonic friends are on here as well. And I'm so glad they came out to support me today. Just to get started, the idea of emotional sobriety is very fluid. I mean, it's one of the most subjective things there is, in my opinion, in AA. And I'm going to be sharing a lot of my experienced opinion, but I'm going to try to stick to a lot of facts too. What I learned about the idea of emotional sobriety is that, when do you have it and when don't you? It's not like that. I don't mean to imply that. If you'd have known, I'd not have thought I had emotional sobriety. If you'd have been at this workshop 20 years ago, you'd have been highly likely I wasn't emotionally sober yet. And if you'd have been at it when I started in 1992, you'd have said, why is he doing this workshop? But you know what? It's all about, it's about the process, and it's about growing along spiritual lines the AA way. But for me, it was a lot of myth understanding and misunderstanding about the spiritual disease of alcoholism. A lot of misunderstanding that I had along the way. And I just want to touch back a little bit on my story to set that up, because not everybody's going to identify with me. Not a lot wouldn't. Hopefully a lot of you don't. I think that the debacle I subjected myself to, and the misinformation and myth-information and multiple misdiagnoses I got along the way set me up for failure. And I'm not blaming, I'm reporting. I want to say this before I get really started. Everything I share this weekend, I want you to know something. I have recovered from it. I will not share anything that has not been resolved through the process of the 12 steps in AA, because I don't think this is the right forum to bring otherwise unresolved conflict. That's for my sponsor, and that's for step work. And then I was taught to bring the solution to you. And the problem, by the way, the problem is a whole lot briefer when I bring it with a solution that's already been solved. So, and I think that's the correct forum for this. I believe that alcoholism is a lot different than just being alcoholic. And I'll get into that a little later. I almost died sober because I didn't understand what my condition was. I heard a lot of things when I was new. My sobriety date is November 8, 1977. One day at a time. And I heard Rosalind is on here from Palm Springs. She's the one with 1971. And my sponsor here is Boston Tommy Marr from Florida. I'm glad my sponsor came on to support me. And, I was raised in an alcoholic home. That didn't make me alcoholic, but it put a definite spin on personalities. And as I look back, a lot of the emotional troubles I've had in my life, and that included into sobriety, I'm a firm believer that if I don't get a full knowledge of my condition, not self-knowledge, not knowing how my mind works, but a full knowledge of my condition, that the likelihood of my recovery is going to be precarious at best. And I learned that through Bill Wilson's experience, as a matter of fact. But I want to tell you what led up to my discovery of what Bill Wilson did to recover from his emotions, because my mind is a lot like his, I take it. I really wish I could talk to him. I wish I could sit down and have a conversation with him. But I had to settle for his writings, his history, his relationships with several people who had a great influence on me. So I have to settle for that. But I sure wish if there could one person that could be brought back that I could sit on a park bench with for a couple hours, it would be Bill Wilson himself, because I identify so greatly with him. By the way, Tina, thank you for opening this up. You've got more. You energize me, actually. I don't even have a monster to drink here, but I don't need one now. I seem to have been born this way. I like what Bill Wilson wrote in the Big Book. He says some of us seem to have been born that way. As far back as I can remember, I've had this conflict with the world. I've had this conflict with myself. I've had this conflict with everybody I meet. I've always felt strange. I've always felt different. I've always felt separate. I've always felt alone. Even when I'm with people that I know care about me, I've often felt alone, even with them. I once heard Johnny H. speak. He spoke at one of my early conventions, my first one, as a matter of fact. And he said something that was to strike me deeply And unbeknownst to me at the time, it had a lot to do with my staying for that first 7 years of sober madness that I was in. He was talking about being in solitary confinement on all fours, barking at the moon, wanting to get out of prison, but afraid to get out of prison. And he said, why? He said, because I feel too good for the bad people and too bad for the good. And you know what? That went right past my head and right to my heart. And I understood something about me that was to take a long time to set me free. But the seed was planted when he said he felt too good for the bad people and too bad for the good. That describes my mind and emotions from the earliest memories I've got. Some of the things that I'll share briefly about from my family life in my early years is important because even though it didn't make me an alcoholic, it had a great influence on that thing we call the ism factor. And I didn't know that either. I've been in psychiatry since the age of 9 and not as a potential doctor of psychiatry. I got my first diagnosis at the age of 9, and I continued to get diagnoses to the age of 27. And then at 7 years sober, I got 3 more diagnoses psychiatrically, and I'll tell you about those later. You see, I was convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt that I have psychiatric problems, but not alcoholic. I mean, I would rather be bipolar, manic depressive, and chemically imbalanced than be alcoholic. I have to tell you the truth. I'll tell you what led up to that in a little while. So I'm raised in this alcoholic home. My father's an alcoholic by his own words. My father was a truck driver out of Chicago. He worked for a guy named Jimmy Hoffa out of Michigan, and he brought his work home. And my dad wanted me to be a tough guy like him. He tried to toughen me up. My older brother, he's a tough guy. To this day, my older brother's a tough guy. My sister's a tough guy, for crying out loud. And I wrote poetry. And so that just made my father insane. And I didn't know what to do with all that. And my mind and my emotions vast. If you could just imagine a Rubik's Cube on my shoulders for a head, I could never get the colors right. I could never get my mind right. And so many times people tried to beat that into me, talk it into me, therapy me. And by the way, the things I'm going to say about mental health system is not to deter anybody from seeking help. It is not to criticize them. They just didn't know what they were dealing with. The best they had was the practice of that mental health medicine, they call it. And AA has a different approach to that worked for me. I'll just say that. But, my father was a violent alcoholic. My father would drink that brown whiskey and he'd beat my mom half to death. My mother would drink tequila and she would beat him back up, we like that. We cheered her on sometimes. And I was caught in the middle of that. That didn't make me alcoholic. I want to keep saying that. None of this is going to be made me alcoholic. My father would go to work on the road. He drove out of Chicago on the road. And he took his union work seriously. He always carried guns. He was never without a weapon. And he wasn't bashful about using it. So what Bill Wilson said about a child growing up in an alcoholic home is bound to be more or less neurotic. And that came into play later on, and funny thing, I'm the only member of my family that ever went to church. And so I would go to Mountain View Evangelical Free Church on Sundays. It was a little country church right on Rock River in Illinois. And I loved it there. I really did. If I could have stayed there all day, every day, I probably would have been okay. It's sort of like being in AA. You can go to meetings all day, stay in AA, but that doesn't render me sober. It renders me out of the world, if you really want to know the truth. And there is a time when I wish I could have stayed in meetings all the time, but that's not the case. And I would go to church. My nickname in church was Little Wayne. And by the way, I hear someone ripped off my name. I don't get any royalties for it or nothing, but that was my nickname. I was a little guy, I was a little squirt back then. If you know me now, I'm 6'3", I weigh 275, and I'm not that little guy anymore, and I'm not bullied anymore. But back then, I was a little kid. I sprouted late in life. I got picked on a lot because I was vulnerable and susceptible. That didn't make me alcoholic, but it put a definite spin on my personalities. I was a peculiar kid. I had odd habits. My first obsession was not alcohol. I'd like to say it was, but it wasn't. My first obsession was milk-bone dog biscuits. I need to share that because that was one of the leads to my first diagnosis. My dad had a hunting dog, and my mom used to give that dog treats of milk-bone dog biscuits, and us kids didn't get any treats. The dog did, and that kind of was one of my first resentments, was that my dog would get those treats and I wouldn't. And, I have to admit that I wondered what was so good about them, and so I tried one, and it might have been the attention that I got behind it, But I got to tell you something. Something about that just got to my attention, and I just had to have them. I just couldn't stop thinking about them. Normal other kids were out playing on the sand lot. All I could think about was that milk-bone dog biscuit. When I get home, I'm going to have me one. I just could not stop thinking about it. And, my mom thought it was cute at first, but then it got kind of ugly. My dad would be playing poker on Friday night with all his truck driver buddies. My mom and their wives would be out in the kitchen doing what they were doing. And I would go get that box of milk bones. I'd grab a couple of milk bones out of the box. And I'd walk right into the card room next to my dad and start eating on them. And it just made my father insane. I think I liked that a little bit. And then they took to hiding them from me. And I found out I'm a little investigator. And I started finding them. And then they got them to where I couldn't get them. And my mind just never stopped thinking about them, trying to find them. I know this is about alcoholism, but this is about the ism factor that led up to that first drink. And I couldn't find him anymore, and I had to have one. Time goes on, and one Saturday, my mom was out in the kitchen, and I see the dog. I jump behind the couch and hide behind the couch. They think I'm outside playing wiffle ball with my brother and sister, and I'm in the house hiding behind the couch. My dad's dog walks through the living room, and I swear he looks at me and cocks his little neck because he knows why he's going out to the kitchen. You know how they are. And I hear this rustling around in the kitchen. And then a few moments later, I see my dad's dog come trotting through the living room with that milk bone dangling from his mouth. It was a family-sized milk bone. I'd seen them advertised on TV, and I wanted a family size. They were the big ones. And all of a sudden, I see him trotting, and he's got one of the big ones dangling from his mouth, and he doesn't know what hit him. On top of him, got him in a headlock, and I'm doing everything I can to get him to drop that milk bone, and he won't. And so I resorted to, I bit his ear is what I did. I'm chewing on his ear, and I chewed on that ear until he dropped that milk bone. And as he dropped that milk bone, my first thought was, I'm winning. I'm thinking, I've got it now. And as I'm reaching for the milk bone, the reason he dropped that milk bone is so he could bite me back. And he did. He locked on my face right here. I got a scar there. I have a scar there where he locked onto my face, and he shook me for everything I'm worth. And I got to tell you something. From that day to this, I've not had one milk bone. Haven't needed no milk bone sponsor. Haven't needed any 12-step meetings. Haven't needed any step work. I have not had one milk bone from that day to this. Let me tell you, if that would have been my reaction to alcohol, I wouldn't have been here. So I had a lot of emotional problems. Just to set this up, because I know there's a lot of people in AA that don't understand what's wrong with them. And that was my theme song through life. Okay, I'm alcoholic, or I'm bipolar, but back then it was manic depressive, or I'm depressed, or all these different things I was being diagnosed. Okay, that might be, but what's wrong with me? I never got past the theme, what's wrong with me? I just never bought into or believed what they were telling me. I just couldn't for some reason. And so we fast forward now, and I'm in eighth grade now, and I'm a peculiar kid. In the first and second grade, I'm eating crayons, biting people, chasing people around, and they're trying to keep me harnessed down. And they don't know what's wrong with Lil Wayne. But they don't understand anything about alcoholism at home at that time. They don't know what to think of me. They're trying to get a handle on me, and come into eighth grade, and I'm still acting really weird and peculiar and scared. So they gave me this test that they developed in the 40s, I think. It was called the IQ test. Now, I know many of you probably took the IQ test at one time or another in your life. I'm sure some of you did. And so they thought they'd get a beat on old Lil Wayne if they gave him this test and see how he did. And I took that IQ test, and I have to tell you something. By the way, if you've taken that IQ test, you can call me out if you like, but here's the truth. If you score a 100, you're pretty smart. If you score a 120, you're a borderline genius. If you score a 150 or above, there's an organization called Mensa that will recruit you. And they will offer you an opportunity to sit in a room and think for people. Isn't that great? And my score was 57. That was my score. And I didn't cheat. Now, in the state of Texas, if you score a 57, you can't even be executed for murder because they call you too retarded to be murdered, to be put to death. And don't be offended by the term retarded. I know it's not politically correct right now, nor is it humane, but that's what they called it back then. They diagnosed me mentally retarded, and they took me out of the main class, and they put me in what they called the retarded class. And it got upgraded to remedial education in 1968 after I graduated, but it was retarded. And I got taken out of my home with my parents, and I got put in this group home. And for a little while, I improved. But I got to tell you something. I was convinced that there was something terribly wrong with me mentally, emotionally, and the psychiatric diagnosis I started getting subjected to at the age of 9. You know what? I didn't tell what happened to me. My parents knew basically what happened to me, but I didn't tell anybody at school. But at the age of 9, I was taken hostage by a guy from the neighborhood. You know, back then all the houses were heated by coal heat, and they all had coal furnaces, and they had coal bins in the basement that trucks would back up to, and they would dump the coal into the coal bins so that we could then stoke the furnaces. And we didn't have the word pedophile back then, but this neighbor guy took me off the street and locked me in his coal bin for 3 days and tortured me. And I'm not going to go into that detail. This is not the appropriate forum for that. But to tell you that didn't leave a mark would be a lie. And I'm not looking for sympathy, nor am I looking for pity. That's just what happened. And I lived with that. And I started to act even more peculiar. Did that make me alcoholic? No, that didn't make me alcoholic. But I'm about to become alcoholic. So I go. So now I've shut down. I'm going to church. I'm afraid to be around my dad. I just don't know what to think. I don't have the tools or the equipment to deal with all this. And but I'm not going to drink that brown stuff my dad drinks, and I'm not going to drink that clear stuff that my mom drinks, because unspeakable things take place when that becomes a regular part of their night. And so now I get all the way through high school. A guy named Tom, he looked out after me. I call him my first life sponsor, because this one Friday, you know, they had these tall hall lockers, and us 11 kids, and I'm gonna upgrade myself. There was 11 of us kids in the special class, and we didn't mix with the rest of the school population because they're trying to protect us from the bullies. You know how they are. They're in AA too, by the way. They showed up in AA, and just because they got sober doesn't mean they quit doing that. But the fact of the matter is that I was scared of closed-in places. Here's why. When I was having last period gym, we was walking back from gym, going to take showers, and these 3 wrestlers grabbed 3 of us kids from the special class, and they locked each one of us in a hall locker. I didn't have the wherewithal to know how to open it from the inside. Why would I? And they didn't find us till Monday morning. So I came out of that locker differently than I went in. That didn't make me alcoholic, but it exacerbated an already pre-existing condition of mind and emotion. And I'll get into that in a minute. But I didn't know that. Well, Tom, this guy that's in my same year of school, but he's not in my class, he went and found those 3 wrestlers, and he beat the holy bejeebers out of them, if you will. And I became close to Tom. Tom was my protector through school. I needed a protector back then. I don't need one now, but I needed one then. And thank God Tom was there for me. And fast forward to senior year, it's 1968. And we're having the senior dance, and Tom takes me to the senior dance as his date. Now, I've already got the broken mind, the broken spirit that I don't know anything about till I get to AA. Tom takes me to the dance. He calls me his date. So I went with him to the dance. And I don't know what to do. It's in the gymnasium. And I'm scared. I don't know what to do with all these people. I don't want to be around them. I want to go back to my little room with the other 10 people. Just, you know. So, and Tom said I would be okay. So I'm there in the gym, and Tom says to me, I'll be right back. And he walks away and leaves me standing there. There's boys and girls out on the dance floor doing what they do, you know. I don't know none about this stuff. We play miniature golf in the special class. That's what we play. We play miniature golf in the afternoon. That's how we do school. And then we go back in time for gym, for last period gym. So Tom goes off, and I'm just standing there in terror because he left me by myself. Moments later, he comes back, and he's got his hand tucked in his jacket like this, and he walks up on me and pulls out this long brown bottle with a red, white, blue label with the name Budweiser across it, King of Beers. I don't know what that means. But he says, here, drink this. It'll make you feel better. And I was about to be introduced to a solution that I would chase for a long, long time. He pulled out that Budweiser and says, here, kid, drink this. It'll make you feel better. I didn't know I was a guzzler, folks, but I'd have drank battery acid for Tom. Tom was my hero. Tom took care of me. He looked after me. I didn't know that I had formed what Bill Wilson talked about as a faulty emotional dependency on Tom. I'll get into that later. And so I took that bottle, and, you know, in NA, they say things like pick up. That's an NA term, picking up. In AA, we say bottoms up. That's, you know, bottoms up. You hear that when there's a cheer in a bar, they'll say bottoms up. And well, what I did was I went bottoms up, and I guzzled that entire bottle of beer down, let out a big old belch, and I said, Tom, that tastes terrible. I want a Pepsi-Cola. And Tom said these immortal words to me. He said, that's okay, kid. Have another. You'll get used to it. Now, here's what Tom meant by that. You see, Tom, to this very day, is still a friend of mine. Tom, he is the son of a politician in my hometown. His dad was the second wealthiest man in my hometown. So he had liquor throughout his basement. He had a bar in the basement. He was a politician, so they entertained all the time. And what happened was Tom got into his dad's liquor one night, got liquored up. And like many of us do, he got disoriented and he had to pee. He thought he was in the bathroom. He was in his bedroom. He thought he was standing over the stool. He was actually standing over an open dresser drawer, and he peed in his dresser. And he said he almost went crazy trying to flush it. That's what he said. And he said, I'm never doing that again. His mom made him do his own laundry. And he has, from that day to this, his mouth to my ear, he's never got drunk like that again because that was enough for him. Now, between you and me, I just don't think he gave it the royal try, if you want to know the truth. But that's what he meant when he said I would get used to it. But you see, he's not an alcoholic. I didn't know nothing about alcoholism. All I know is somewhere between 4 or 5 Budweisers, I got so good looking I couldn't stand it. I wasn't retarded anymore. I just developed about a 200 IQ, if there is such a thing. I looked down the dance floor, eyeballed me a blue-eyed blonde, danced with some loser, and all of a sudden I wanted to dance with her. I'd never danced in my life. I've played miniature golf. That's it. And been in that special class. I looked at Tom, and I started heading out to the dance floor, and Tom says, where are you going? I said, I'm going out there. And Tom tried to stop me, but I went. And I didn't even know what to say to her when I got up to her. I just know I wanted to do whatever they were doing. And I snatched these words out of thin air from someone else and said it to someone else. Can I cut in? And she looked at me, and she said yes. Her date went off. And I guess he went to the bathroom. We danced a couple of dances. I found out later the reason she gave me that dance because she recognized me from the special class. She was giving me what some of you know is a sympathy dance. She felt sorry for me because I was in. Somewhere along the line, she started liking me. We danced 2 dances. And by the time her date got back, she shoved him off and she stayed with me the rest of that dance. Found out later that night sex meant 2 people. I had no idea about that. I'd never had sex, didn't know. Actually, I was having sex, but it was by myself, and I thought I was pretty good at it, and she complicated the entire procedure. This is the first time I drank. I couldn't remember what happened that night much. I could remember the start of it, but I couldn't remember what happened after that. Tom told me I had a great time. Just fast forward. I did not know that there's a thing called the abnormal reaction to alcohol. I didn't know that there was an unusual effect produced by alcohol. I didn't know any of the things that I'll be sharing about in the sessions to follow. So I'm going to save some of that for them. Something happened to me. You know, I'm 17 years old because I got kept back a year with the special class. I was supposed to graduate in 1967. So now it's spring 1968. And find out she's pregnant. Now, she's 16, I'm 17. Now, in the state of Illinois, that's called statutory rape, and they don't care if you're retarded. I found that out, let me tell you. And so back in those days, many of the folks that are my age or older, you remember this, they had what's called a shotgun wedding. If a girl got pregnant, they got married, or the guy that impregnated her got dead. That's just the way it was back then. And so they informed me I was going to get married. And I want you to just imagine the looks on their faces when we drove to, some of you are going to appreciate this, we drove to Palmyra, Missouri, where it's the only place in the Union where we could get married at the age of 17 and 16 with parental consent, without a 3-day wait, without blood test and all that stuff. And we got married. And on the way, and she came with her mom and dad. I came with my mom and dad. We got married. And as we're leaving, after we left the Justice of the Peace, her dad says to me, when that baby's born, you will get divorced. And then he pulled out that gun and he says, well, I'm going to put you in the ground. And my dad said he meant that. And later on, my dad says, we got to get you out of town. He might not wait. And now I want you to bear in mind what my transcripts from high school looked like. In 1968, they changed that. It's no longer about being retarded. In 1968, they took it off the high school diplomas and everything, and they had special ed. But when my dad said, we got to get you out of town, what he meant was, we're going to join the Navy, he said. We're going to not the Navy, he said, we're going to join the military. I don't know what that we stuff is. So he took me to recruiters with my transcripts. And, you know, there's a little conflict going on over in Southeast Asia, Vietnam. And there is no way I would have been accepted had it not been for that conflict that was going on. They were looking for bodies. The draft was in process. And we went in there, and the recruiters were all there in a row. And this snappy Marine, I didn't know it was a Marine. I just saw this guy come up with a sharp uniform. The pleats of his pants or his shirt could cut you probably. And he had medals galore, and his arm was full of what I now know as pay grade. And I just wanted to be one of those guys. And so my dad took me in there to meet him as a Marine. He's what I come to find out is a sergeant. And he says, "So you want to be a Marine?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And my dad passed him my transcripts. And he's reading my transcripts, and he gets to that part where it talks about me being in, it wasn't called special class, it was called retarded. And he looked at my dad and he says, "Is this true? Is this the class he was in?" And I was proud of it, actually. I said, "Yes, it is." And he goes just like this, and he pointed next door, and he sent me to the Navy. And the Navy took me. Now we're going to fast forward. I went to Vietnam, came back. We got divorced immediately after I signed divorce papers immediately after I got back. Got drunk for the second time in my life. Went into another blackout, had no idea I was in that blackout. And if you've had blackouts, I know many of you have, you don't know what's going on during a blackout. You only know you've been in a blackout when you come out of the blackout. Well, I signed the divorce papers when I returned home from my first tour of duty in Vietnam because her dad was waiting for me with the divorce papers. The baby was born while I was gone. I didn't get any mail while I was in Vietnam from anybody, except my mom sent me 2 letters. No one wrote me in Vietnam. And I think that was a resentment on my list right away. And I wasn't notified when the baby was born. I didn't know nothing about it. When I got home on leave for 30 days, I was met by her father who had the divorce papers with him. I signed them, and I went and got drunk. 5 days later, I come to, not pass out, but from a blackout, and I'm driving a car with somebody next to me. I have no idea who she is. Well, I found out that I asked her who she was, and she didn't like that. She's wearing a wedding ring, and I'm thinking, oh, my God, I've now violated one of the 10 commandments again. The thou shalt not kill went by the wayside in Vietnam, and now I'm with a married woman. I can't believe I'm cheating with somebody's wife. I just can't believe it. And she looked at me and she said, "What's the matter, honey?" And I thought my name's not Honey. And so I said, "Who are you?" And she hit me in the shoulder. She says, "Apparently you women don't like to be asked who you are." To Palmyra, Missouri, to the same courthouse I got married in prior to that. And her and I got married. The laws were a lot looser back then than they are now. And so now I'm married, and after spending 21 days of my leave with her, I signed up for another tour of duty in Vietnam because I felt safer there than I did with her. And that's just the way it was. I don't have time to go into all of that, but that set the stage. When I came home the second time and got discharged, and this madness was on me. The madness was on me long before I took the first drink. The first drink did something for me it's not supposed to do. And that is what set it in my soul to keep drinking. I didn't know I was drinking for the effect produced. I didn't know I was drinking to quiet the madness in my mind. I wasn't consciously drinking for a solution. I was just drinking because something was happening to me and I didn't understand it. Fast forwarded, I couldn't stay in that house anymore. I got afraid I was going to wake up and hurt one of my 2 daughters that I had with her. And so I moved out. Fast forward to the dumpster I lived in. I had night terrors all the time. And that isn't because just of Vietnam. That's because of just my mind and my emotions from my whole life. Frightened. You know, the book talks about the fabric of my existence shot through it. Through what? Fear. Fear, the evil and corroding thread. The fabric of my existence shot through with it. I believe I was born afraid. I really believe that. I believe I was born afraid and just didn't know what was wrong with me. I got back to Vietnam, lived on the street, had no desire to stop drinking. I didn't even know what alcoholism was. I was unaware my father had gone off and joined this cult, is what they called it back then, AA. I'm seeing psychiatrists now. I've been diagnosed several times. The Navy discharged me honorably because of the medals I received from Vietnam, from my service, kept me from being punished because I refused to go to treatment. They said I have an alcohol problem. I said I don't have an alcohol problem. All I drink is beer. And I ended up taking an honorable discharge. If you think about it, I loved the United States Navy. I loved everything about it. I loved the esprit de corps. I loved the snappy uniform. I loved wearing my medals. I loved the respect that I got from other sailors and officers. But I couldn't not drink, and I didn't understand that. But every chance I got on weekends, when I was able to get off the ship, I would go drink. And I wouldn't mean to get drunk, because I could go weeks, or I was what's called a periodic at the time. I'm sure if I would have drank longer than I did, I would become an everyday drinker. But I didn't drink to that point. Like I'm sure some of the people in this meeting didn't drink to the point where he's an everyday drinker. But I'm sure I would have ended up there. I was a periodic. So I could go out to sea and not drink. I could go out to sea. But you know what? In between drinks, the madness of my mind would take over. I didn't understand what that was. How would I know? I haven't been educated. I have not been instructed as to what's going on with me by people more qualified to describe that than we are here in AA. I ended up sleeping in a dumpster. Make a long story short, in November 3rd, 1972, I went to my first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous at the behest of a guy named Harvey who owned a restaurant that I stumbled into on the night of Halloween of 1972. And I stumbled in there, and my dad had come to my dumpster that I was sleeping in. I don't know if any of you ever slept in a dumpster, but it's kind of a mobile home. It's on wheels. And it was a little after midnight, and I heard a knock on my dumpster lid. And I was home. I was alone because some of you women are picky. I couldn't understand why none of you would ever come home with me. Even Dirty Sally wouldn't come home with me just because I live in a dumpster. Pretty shallow, don't you think? I've heard many women share in AA, and they often mention about how they had become a fallen women. Well, none of you ever fell into my dumpster. I just want you to know that loud and clear. So I had a bit of a resentment about that. So fast forward. So after I told my dad, no thanks, I'm doing fine, when he asked me if I want to come home with him, I didn't know he was paying a 12-step call on me. I didn't know he'd gone off and joined this cult thing called AA. He didn't say that. He just asked me if I want to come home. And I said, no thanks. What I did was I jumped out of that dumpster, went for that walk, and ended up Harvey's restaurant. Usually there's truckers in that coffee shop all night. All night. This night there wasn't a soul in there. And bear in mind, I've been psychiatrically institutionalized 17 times. Never diagnosed alcoholic. All I drink is beer. And I've got these, at that point in time, I think I'd had 14 institutionalizations. I've got 3 more coming before I get sober. So I get to this restaurant. I look inside, and there's this little old 800-year-old woman wiping down a coffee bar. Come to find out it's the owner's wife. I didn't know that then. I sized her up, and I thought, well, I want to work her for something. I'm a bum. Now they call you homeless. Back then I was a bum. And that's what they called you. You're a bum. Today you're homeless. I kind of, if it makes you feel better, I think, whatever. And so on that little wobbly malt shop stools that they had back then, and she kind of crooked her neck up at me, and she dropped that rag she was cleaning the counter with, and she threw me a smile. Nobody's smiling at me, by the way. I'm angry. I live angry. And she comes walking down the bar, and she brings me a glass of water and a hot cup of coffee. She says, what can I do for you, sweetie? She kind of threw me off my game, but I went into my routine. I began to tell her things I didn't want to tell my sponsor in my fifth step for fear she'd judge me. And I'm a guy who's afraid of judgment. Come to find out, that was one of my biggest fears, is the fear of being judged, because it sets me apart from the world. I didn't know that until I did my step work. So she said, what can I do for you, sweetie? And so I went into my routine. I told her about the alcoholic home. I told her about the bullies in school. I told her about getting locked in that locker. I told her about Vietnam and the terrible tragedies that I saw and was involved in. I told her about being in a dumpster. I told her about that pedophile that locked me in that coal bin. Tears were rolling down her face. And I'm thinking I'm winning because tears were rolling down her face. Folks, I found out later the reason she was crying is because her husband, Harvey, who's in AA, and he's one of them old timers, he's having a hard time staying sober. And she's in this program called Al-Anon. I have no way of knowing, why would you know what that is? But it turned out she's in Al-Anon. And by the way, those of you that are in Al-Anon, I know maybe you're here, if you're a waiter or a waitress, please put an Al-Anon badge on so an alcoholic has a fighting chance. Because I thought I was working her when I told her my story. But no, she was crying because Harvey was having a hard time staying sober. And she knew from her education, I suppose, in Al-Anon, that Harvey's only hope is have another alcoholic to work with. So she decided it was going to be me. And I thought I was working her. Come to find out, she was actually working me to keep me there for a couple of days. And that's exactly what she did. She fed me. She let me mop and wax the dining room floor for 2 sausage sandwiches and whole wheat toast. She kept me there. I thought I was winning. What happens is Harvey comes in, and just to make this as short as I can, Harvey gives me that alcoholic greeting. He comes in, the afternoon, evening of November 2nd, and he gives me the bum's handshake. And as he shakes my hand, I like money. I like paper. When I'm on the bum, I like paper, but I know what coins feel like. And I knew this wasn't anything you could spend. And then when he got done shaking my hand, I looked at the coin and it was brass and it had these 2 A's on it. Didn't mean nothing to me. And he glibly says, turn it over. So I turned it over and had a prayer. Didn't say nothing about money, food, or shelter. So I wouldn't. He said, take that coin down to 410 16th Street tomorrow at about noontime. There's some friends of mine there. You tell them Harvey sent you. They're going to help you. And I'll come along later in the afternoon to see how you're doing. When you get there, you'll see a light bulb hanging on a cord. If that light's on, go ahead and go on in. They'll be expecting you. I didn't know what to think about that, but I went. And had he told me I was going to AA, I wouldn't have went. Had he told me I'm an alcoholic, there's no way I would have went. What he did was he did that thing called spiritual trickery is what he did. He got me to go because he knew I would if I thought I was going to get a handout or something to eat. If he'd have implied I was going to get a hand up, there's no way I would have went there because I'm doing fine. I've got my own place to live over there in that dumpster behind Larry's Oasis. What do I want for? So I go down there the next morning, find the address, find the light bulb. Harvey said if it's on, go in. He didn't tell me what to do if it was flickering on and off. I don't know if you got a mind like mine, but the light won't quit flickering. So I decided it's probably Morse code or some crap like that. It must be a message. I'm not going to go in until it stops flickering. I lost my mind. Raced down to Larry's Oasis, moosed me up some Budweisers, got oiled up, and I started thinking, they owe me now. It's been a long day. I don't care if that light's on, I'm going in. So I go back there that night. It's about 8 o'clock at night. Interestingly enough, it's Friday, November 3rd. And it would have been any other day. Any other day. Is it odd or is it God? I like to say that because we don't know. Sometimes it's odd how God shows up. And I went there any other night. There wouldn't have been a soul there because this group only had 3 meetings a week, 2 on Friday, 1 on Saturday. This happened to be Friday night. I get back there. Lo and behold, I don't look for the light bulb. I don't care. And I'm going in. And I went racing into that basement doorway, failing to notice the door hitter's 5'10-ish. I'm 6'3-ish. And I cracked that door hitter at my eyebrow. The impact lifted me off of my feet. I hit the deck, and I slid into my first meeting with Alcoholics Anonymous. And inside that room was a round table of 6 or 7 old men, must have been talking about death and dying. I slid right between 2 of them. And this old guy gets up out of his chair, stands over me, and gives me the safe sign. And then he growls and says, slide right in here, you big dummy. We got a wrench to fit every nut that comes in the door. And by the looks of you, it's going to have to be an adjustable wrench. I didn't like him right away. And then he introduced himself as he picked me up off the deck. I'm an alcoholic. And when he said that, I thought, oh, you poor SOB, you're an alcoholic. Now, I've been in enough therapy to know that when that guy or gal sitting across that desk from me, when they self-disclose something to me, I know exactly what they're doing. They're priming the pump. They want me to give them something back. So I gave him something back. I said, well, I'm ADD. And he says, I'll bet you are. I said, you know what else I am? He said, what? I'm OCD. He says, I'll bet you are. And then he says, you know what else I think you might be? And that's kind of stumped me. I thought I won. I said, what's that? He said, I think you might be ODD. And I had no idea what that diagnosis was in 1972. There wasn't one. He says, you are very odd. And he says, I'm going to be your sponsor. And from that day to November 8, 1977, I didn't get drunk every day, but I was drinking before every meeting I went to, usually drinking after every meeting. I don't relate to the description of the real alcoholic at all. I don't relate to that at all in my mind. And so for the next 5 years and 5 days, I went to meetings and drank. Could not drink. I don't know what it was. You know, in the Navy, I had enough of an understanding that by its nature, ethanol alcohol is not an addictive substance by its nature. I knew that. And so that's what perplexed me. That's what was baffling about this thing was I know it's not biochemically an addictive substance that most people would get addicted from if they use it. Because the fact is 9 out of 10 people can drink safely, period. So I knew that. So why is it I can go 3 weeks or a month or 2 months without a drink, but then life goes to pieces and then I pick up a drink? I didn't know I was drinking for the effect produced. I didn't know I was drinking for the solution because I didn't have any awareness. I didn't have any understanding. And so here I am. So now November 8, 1977 rolls around. I show up. My sponsor asked me to show up early for a meeting. Now, bear in mind, I'm seeing psychiatrists on the side. I'd done something so heinous in 1976, before I got sober, that I got locked up in that East Moline State Insane Asylum one more time. I got put in a straitjacket in a padded room, and they kept me in that straitjacket for a long time. And I was subjected to shock treatment, and I didn't know what was going on around me. That did not get me to quit drinking, folks. And on November 8, 1977, my November 7th, my sponsor asked me to meet him to help me set up for the meeting. Now, I don't know. I couldn't have told you this then, but I can tell you now. I love that guy. Something about him. That's why I kept going to AA, was because of William Barney Barnett. Something about that guy. I just had to be around him. I was willing to drink and go to a meeting just so I could be around Barney. That's not a natural reaction, I got to tell you, for me. And so I would try to behave, but I just couldn't much. I seemed powerless over my emotions and my mind. I would get an impulse and I would follow it, and I couldn't stop it. And the only thing that gave me any solace was 3 or 4 Budweisers. That would give me some solace. But then I would always overshoot that mark, and I would drink until something stopped me. And then when something stopped me, I could go weeks or months without a drink again. And I didn't understand that was alcoholism. I didn't understand that. So on November 8th, the morning of November 8th, I stole a 6-pack of warm Budweiser on my way to the noon meeting at 7 a.m. I got there early, around 90-ish or something like that, and I sat down on the front steps of the Moline group and began to drink that warm Budweiser. Shortly before 10 o'clock, Barney comes walking up the sidewalk. He sees the 3 empty cans on the ground, doesn't even look at the cans in my lap, looks at me in the eye instead, and says, "Why don't you come in and help me set up for the meeting?" I don't know what compelled me to do that, folks, but I hid those other 3 cans of beer in the bush so I could go help Barney set up for the meeting. 2 things happened really quickly. We got the room all set up, and I noticed another Tom that's in my life now. I hate Tom. He's a newcomer. He's got 14 days sober. How do I know that? Because every time he comes to the meeting, he says, quote, "My name's Tom. I'm an alcoholic, and I have 3 days." And then the group claps, and he smiles. And, "Hi, my name's Tom. I'm an alcoholic. I've got 6 days sober." Clap. "Hi, my name's Tom. I'm an alcoholic. I have 9 days." And he starts clapping for himself. And I just can't stand this guy. And then he says, "My name's Tom, I'm an alcoholic, and Barney's my sponsor." And I thought, no, he's not. He's mine. All of a sudden, this thing took over me. And I decided Tom needed to die because there was only room for one sponsee with Barney, and that's me. And so here's Tom at the coffee bar, 14. He didn't help us set up, by the way. I want you to hear that. Tom was too busy writing his 4th step to make his sponsor happy. That was my opinion. And Barney, I'm sitting in this chair after we set up the room, noticing Tom didn't help. He's too busy working the steps. And Barney's up at the coffee bar where Tom's writing on his 4th step. He's got his arm around. He's already on his 4th step with 14 days. Got his arm around him at the coffee bar. When I saw Barney's arm go around him, I made a decision to kill him that night. By the way, that isn't podium passion. That, unfortunately, it was real possible I could do that. And all of a sudden, about before the meeting started, that front door flew open, and this guy come flying in there and did a facial, hit the deck face first. We found out later his wife did a drive-by. And he hits the deck, and he bounces like a dead fish. And I see Barney. And by the way, I've been going to meetings 5 years and 5 days. Not once have I said I'm an alcoholic. Not once. Not once. He hits the deck, and I see Barney turn around and look at him. Tom looked at him, and I thought, I know what Barney's going to do. You know, you've been around AA for 5 years. Even if you're drinking, you pick up on the language and the information. You know how to talk. You know, you learn the language and how to talk to keep people away from you. Like me, I used the God chatter a lot because that kept you away from me. Or I would say I feel, because I know you can't argue with that. So I would use those terms to keep you away, but I would never say I'm an alcoholic. Well, I raced over and picked Jimmy up off the deck. By the way, we'll call him Jimmy because that was his name. But I wanted to get to him before Barney did. I picked him up off the deck. And I'm holding him up, and I don't know what to say to him. I just don't know. But I remember what Barney said to me, and those words came into my head. And I picked him up and said, "Hi, my name's Wayne B." And he mumbled out, "He's Jimmy so-and-so." And then I said, "I don't know what to say." And then I remember what Barney said. I said, "Well, I'm an alcoholic." And I couldn't believe I said it. And I wanted to take those words back. And Barney heard me say it, and I saw him shoot a look at me when I said that. And then I didn't. I thought, well, what the heck? I might as well go all the way. So I said, "I'm going to be your sponsor." Now, I've got about 3 hours of sobriety. And when I said I'll be your sponsor, Barney left Tom at the coffee bar and started heading my way. Now, if I would have known that's all it would take to get him away from Tom, I'd have sponsored somebody 13 days ago. I'll tell you the truth. Now I know what he's going to do. He's going to poach my newcomer because now I've taken possession. It doesn't take me long to get obsessed. Right now, he belongs to me. He's mine. Barney comes walking up on me and he whispers in my ear, "Dummy," and because that's what his nickname for me was, Big Dummy. He liked to watch that Sanford and Son. Any of you remember that show? And when he called me dummy, I thought, don't talk to me like that in front of my sponsee. I mean, it's like, it's interesting how my mind works. And then he says, "Do you mind if I co-sponsor him?" And I'm thinking, no, you can't. I didn't have a co-sponsor. He's mine. He belongs to me. I'll sponsor. That's what I thought, but what I said was okay. So to make a long story short, Barney's sponsoring behind my back. You know how they are. But he allowed me to think I was. And you know what happened? Me and Jimmy took the steps together to the best of our ability. Right along the way. And then we started sponsoring guys. And as we're working the steps, and I want to tell one last story before I get into what caused me to do a search that I did. What never left me was that uncertainty. Okay, I'm an alcoholic. I said I'm an alcoholic. I read the doctor's opinion. I read the description of the real alcoholic. And I entertained the idea, but it never went from my head to my heart. I didn't identify with the description of the real alcoholic. I would have if I'd have kept drinking. But at that point in time, I didn't identify with that singular message described there. And I didn't read the 12 and 12 because I was told not to. Some well-meaning people in AA that I don't want to get into all that, but they told me to stay away from that book. They said it's Bill's ego. He wrote it to make money. He was depressed when he wrote it. And so rather than, I didn't have the ability to stand up for myself, or I might have read it. So I was limited to the big book. And so for the next 5 years, me and Jimmy and our sponsees, we're doing a day, going to meetings almost every day, working the steps to the best of my ability. Got a full-time job from somebody in AA. My wife came back to me. She's going to Al-Anon. I'm doing AA. We've got what I'm thinking is a happy home, and I'm still crazed, but I'm not hitting her. My sponsor told me whenever I talk to my wife, put my hands in my pockets, and I didn't like it, but I did. And I quit putting my hands on my wife inappropriately, if you know what I mean. And so life is going by 5 years, but I've never been able to outrace this thought. Okay, but what's wrong with me? I still didn't grasp that. And at 5 years sober, I came home from a meeting and found my wife in bed with my sponsee. And the madness just came gushing back, as anybody would understand in that frame of reference right there. I had flipped the switch. I'm not blaming, I'm reporting. I'm not trying to condemn her. This is just the facts of that night. I went over to my dresser drawer and I got that pistol out of my dresser. I aimed it at my sponsee's face with every intention of dropping that hammer. And then it occurred to me, if I shoot him, I won't get to sponsor nobody no more. That's called delusional. So then I pointed at my wife, and I knew if I shot her, I'd have to shoot him, or I'd go to jail. I wouldn't get off on temporary insanity. I all of a sudden remembered where my sponsor lived and ran to my sponsor's trailer with .357 in hand. Knocked on his door. He saw the gun. He let me in anyway, which tells you about his program. I don't know that you should do that, but that's what he did. And he asked me what's wrong. I told him, and he said, "Why are you so mad?" Now, if you heard that story, don't you think I would have a right to be angry? And he says, "Why are you so mad?" So I started to tell him the story again. And he said, "No, I got it. I got the picture. I don't need to see it again. I got it. But why are you so angry?" And I'm thinking he's going over there on Saturday night. This is Friday. I'm thinking he's going over there on Saturday night. I think he's visiting her too, because he ain't got no anger. So he says, "Look, you think you own her. Are you aware that's her body? She can do whatever she wants to do with it. She's living life on life's terms. When you live life on life's terms, you can do anything you want. And she's doing what she wants. She has a right to do whatever she wants." That blew my mind. I said, "But she's my wife." He said, "That doesn't change that." And it stopped me. I don't know where the anger went, but it's like when you find this the oil well explosions, where they actually put it out by putting nitroglycerin into it and blowing it out. That's what he did to me. He blew the flame out. And it's like, I don't understand. And he said, "Look, she has decided to live a certain way of life, and she has a right to do that. You have a right to let her go so she can live that way." Now, if he'd have put it any other way, God, thank God for sponsorship. And I did. I moved out the next day, and she and he been together for 30 years until he passed away from natural causes. He passed away last year from natural causes. They've been together this whole time. That's my 5-minute warning. So fast forward to 7 years sober. I still don't know what's wrong with me. I'm sponsoring a bunch of people. I don't let nobody read nothing but the big book right along with me. My nickname was a big book thumping, one book wonder. That was my nickname. And that was just it. That's how I sponsored. I sponsored with command and control. If you didn't do what I wanted, I would put a gun up to your head and say, don't worry about alcohol killing you. I'll take care of it for you. And I found out that ain't the way you're supposed to sponsor, but that was the best I had at the time. And I'm not bragging, by the way. I'm not trying to be a tough guy. I'm not a tough guy. That's just the way it was. 7 years sober. The night before this event, the night before I was meeting with a sponsee, I pulled my gun on him. The next day, I'm in a meeting, pontificating, being Mr. Spiritual, doing the God chatter for my whole share so that you won't look any closer than my God chatter. And I went home from that meeting, got my 357 out and cleaned it and put it to my head. And I couldn't pull the trigger. I'm so glad I didn't. I'd have killed the wrong guy. You've heard that before. Still don't know what's wrong with me. So I'm going to meetings. So I didn't kill myself that night. And I went to a meeting and talked about it. And some well-meaning AA members played doctor that day. They played doctor. They told me I should go back on medication. You see, I quit taking medication 7 years earlier. And they thought it would be okay to play doctor and tell me to go get medication and go get psychiatric help without asking me any questions about anything that's going on with the steps, sponsorship, or anything like that. They just went right to go get on meds. And I did exactly that. I went and saw a psychiatrist the next day because I was vulnerable to all of that, what they were doing. And I went and saw a psychiatrist. I started out with this. Doc, AA doesn't work. I've been sober 7 years. And excuse me. And I'm worse now than I was then when I was new. He said, I'm worse now than when I was drinking. So he took me at my word and he ran some tests. And I ended up being diagnosed bipolar manic depressive with a chemical imbalance, and he prescribed 3 medications. Lithium, which is also an antidepressant. Some of you ladies know that. They used to prescribe it for PMS, which I knew that, so I wondered why they're prescribing it to me. I don't have female issues, if you know what I mean. And lithium and a new drug that they invited me to try called Prozac. The FDA approved it in 1985. This is 84. And so he gave me free samples. That was to fill the prescription the next day. A funny thing happened, folks, just like with a drink of alcohol. When I picked up that sack containing the free medication, I felt better. Now, I might have been goofy, but I know I shouldn't have felt better till I took it. I'm feeling better just by picking up the sack. And that caused me to call my sponsor. I called Barney. And I said, Barney, I finally know what's wrong with me. Maybe I'm alcoholic. Maybe that's true. But I'm also bipolar, manic depressive chemical imbalance, and I've been given some medication that's going to fix me. I already feel better. And Barney made the comment, well, have you taken them yet? I said, no. He understood that. And he said, meet me tomorrow and bring that medication with you. I want to see it. Barney didn't play doctor. He didn't tell me to take it or not to take it. But what he said was, he said, you know something? There's something peculiar about you. With all this emotional turmoil you've had, with this pain that you've been in, you've always said you don't know what's wrong with you. Listen, I don't know what's wrong with you. And then he said this. He says, you're a lot like that Dr. Bob guy. All right. He says, I'm a lot like that Dr. Bob guy. I relate with his story. You are a lot like that Bill W. character. You're like a fart in the wind. Everybody knows you've been around, but they can't keep a hold of you. You're always gone, and they kind of hope you'll go away and not come back. You're a lot like that Bill W. guy. He says, why don't you do this? Before you take that medication, he says, why don't you try to find out what Bill Wilson did to overcome his depression and madness? Because I have it to believe that he actually overcame his and lived without depression. I was just muted. Am I unmuted now? Okay. And it struck me. He says, quit your job. Go find out what Bill Wilson did. and then do that. Whatever it was that got him to recover from anxiety, depression, and grandiosity. And you know what? I did just that. And the rest of this 3 sessions of this workshop are going to be an overview of what I found, what I did, and how it applies to our 3 main pieces of approved literature, the Big Book, the 12 and 12, and AA Comes of Age, and how that has affected my life. Where I left off. So 7 years sober. My sponsor now has possession of my guns, and he said, "Why don't I give Bill Wilson's history a chance?" And he said, "Why don't you find out what he did? Because I hear he actually overcame his depression and anxiety to live in the clear, as they called it back then, for the rest of his life." Of course, that's not what I was hearing. You know, in those 7 years, I picked up on all this information. And by the way, what I'm sharing is not to be divisive. It's not to be argumentative. It's not to be oppositional. A lot of it's not going to be in agreement with the Big Book because it's in the 12 and 12. So a lot of people don't know what's in the 12 Steps and 12 Traditions. And if you do, you may not know the history of it or how it was combined and the importance of our history book, AA Comes of Age. All 3 of those books are relevant when it comes to the idea of emotional sobriety. But I want to tell you about the course I was led on first. And then tomorrow, I'm going to go through the points that are critical in steps 1 through 12, as far as the alcoholics of my type developing what's so mysterious and very mercurial, if you know what I mean, in my life. So I'm going to slow down a little bit. So after my sponsor said, "Why don't you go find out?" I said, "Well, where do I start? I don't know where to start." It's your job because you're going to be gone for a while. And my sponsor's sponsor at the time was Clarence Schneider, but he had passed away. He had passed away in my 5th year of sobriety. Clarence S. was my sponsor, and he was a very religious man, a very convicted man. And Barney told me he's just like Clarence, but he doesn't relate with Bill W. My sponsor was a Dr. Bob follower. He didn't much like the Bill, but he was humble enough to tell me that you're like him. Which made sense later. And so I said, well, I don't know where to start. So I don't know, are there any yard sale people around here, garage sale or estate sale people? Well, instead of going drinking, I picked up the habit of going yard sailing because, number one, I'm poor. And so otherwise I'd be at Macy's or one of them other department stores, but I did yard sales. And so I was all full of myself. I was fretting, my sponsor had my gun. I didn't know what, I was at this turning point. I'd been to the psychiatrist again. I got 3 more diagnoses. He wants me to start back on medication. People in the fellowship are encouraging me going back on medication and using the Big Book to give me permission. They said, Bill says it's okay to go to outside sources. Well, I know that. That isn't the issue. And so I just don't know what to think, folks. And it's like I've got this Rubik's Cube on my head, on my shoulders. It's just clicking and twisting. And so I went yard sailing. So I'm outside Chicago. I'm in the suburbs of Chicago, and I run across this estate sale. I don't know. It's just an estate sale. And I'm walking around, and I see this. How many of you remember those old galvanized wash tubs? It was this galvanized wash tub, kind of tilted up like this, and it had a sign, $5 doesn't work. And I thought, well, I wonder what that is. Anything $5 is a bargain. And so I went over and looked at it, and it had what turned out to be an old reel-to-reel wire recording device. And it had 6 spools of wire and a bunch of papers underneath it. I had no idea that this is one of the pioneering members of AA in the Chicago area that lived in this house and had passed away. And the youth of their family were selling everything. And I thought, well, it's broken. I can't fix it, but my brother can. For $5, it's a bargain. And I didn't even pay any attention to the papers. So I bought it, and they said, bring the tub back. I said, I will. So I took the tub home, and we pulled that. My brother did fix the recorder, and those 6 spools of wire recording was Bill Wilson, Dr. Silkworth, Dr. Bob, Sister Ignatia. When you think about that, is it odd or is it God? And those papers at the bottom were different articles that they had collected, and in there was a couple of letters from Bill Wilson to this guy who passed away. And it was interesting that I found this letter. And then at the bottom, I found another one. I just want to share that with you because it's so important to my journey of emotional sobriety. This one letter was addressed to this guy and his neighbor, who was another one of the old timers of the Chicago area. And what they had done is they'd written Bill Wilson. And they said in essence this, I'm paraphrasing because I can't remember it word for word. But they said, Bill, how have you been able, this is 1970. 1970. Bill died in 1971. In 1970, they wrote Bill, how have you lived all these years with that terrible depression and anxiety? How have you lived with that without drinking all these years? Because I can't. I don't think I can. And Bill wrote them back. And I'm going to paraphrase. He says, my dear fellow AAs, you're misinformed. I have not had depression since 1956. It has never returned. This is 1970. Now, that, of course, isn't what I was hearing around the tables of AA. I was hearing Bill was depressed, stayed depressed. He was miserable. He was a womanizer, cheating on his wife. There's all kinds of things I was hearing, all the gossip that I was hearing about Bill. And so I dismissed it out of hand because I listened to gossip back then. And I'm sure some of you do too back then. I listened to gossip, and it dissuaded me in the earlier days of going beyond the big book. And I'm reading this letter and I'm thinking, wait a minute. So I called my sponsor and I met with him and I said, what do I think about this? He says, well, that's his own words. Do you want to believe the gossip, or do you want to believe Bill was telling the truth in that letter? And I said, well, I want to believe it. And he said, well, then believe it. He said, why don't you pursue that and find out what it is? And then at the bottom of the pile was another one that unless they've moved it, that letter, which I donated to Akron Archives, that letter is posted on the wall at the recording device and the reels to New York when Frank Mauser had taken over, I think in 1983 at the Archives in New York. And I donated them to Frank because he let me search the archives with the information that I'm about to share with you now and tomorrow, what I was to discover. But in those papers was correspondence from not only him, but Silkworth. There was another article in there called Emotional Sobriety, The Next Frontier, that was published in the Grapevine in 1958. And I read that. And I thought, oh my God. And there was other articles in there from the New York State Medical Society, from other people. And I just gathered that up. And my sponsor said, well, I think you need to research this. He says, quit your job and go find out. And I was a lot like Tina is today. I was on fire. I couldn't wait to do this. And for the next 8 months, I spent time in California, Vermont, New York, Akron, Cleveland, following footnotes. I didn't know what a footnote was. You know, they didn't teach us that in the special class. I started tracing all these footnotes and reading all these articles and doing a hunt that I never thought was possible. I found out that Bill Wilson and I are twins, not money-wise, but mental and emotional. You know, in 1944, this is very significant. In 1944, Bill was invited to New York to address the New York State Medical Society. And this is published. You can Google it. It was published in 1944. I was curious why they invited Bill to be to be questioned. Dr. Bob was not on the main ticket. And I thought that was peculiar because Dr. Bob is a doctor and this is a medical society getting together. And so that piqued my interest. So I researched it. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to ask Bill a significant question. And this is where the doctor's opinion began to meld with me. They said to Bill, had your fellowship of drinkers. Let me back up just 1 minute before I go there. You know, I don't know how many of you know this, but the big book was, many of you know, the big book was published in 1939 with many stories in the back. I don't know if you know this or not, and I'm not being negative or conspiratorial with this message here, but how many of you know that half of those members who wrote those stories died drunk? Half of them died drunk. And that made me curious. Wait a minute. Because it sounds like they lived forever, doesn't it? It sounds like they stayed sober forever. So that was really an interesting fact that I found. And you can actually Google who those members were and where they're from, you can Google that. They have a listing of the people who authored the stories and who died drunk. And that struck me deeply. And you know what? It's interesting that all but one was from New York. The ones who stayed sober were from Akron. I found that interesting as well, from the Akron-Cleveland area. There's there's kind of a thing where a lot of the people back in the day felt Bob was more spiritual than Bill because of that. Because the Akronites were staying sober and a lot of the New Yorkers weren't. And there was one from Akron who was one of the stories who died drunk. But when you research him, you find out he's actually from New York. He moved to Akron to get closer to the founding point of AA. So that piqued my interest too. Is it because they're more spiritual? Why aren't, that baffled me. I didn't understand. So in 1944, when the New York State Medical Society asked Bill this question, of your fellowship of men and women, handful of women at the time, how would you describe their personality makeups? Now, wait a minute. Bill's not a psychologist. He's not a psychiatrist. He's a bankrupt stock speculator. But they asked him, of your fellowship of men and women, how would you describe their personality makeups? And he didn't hesitate. He said, well, had they not been drinkers, half would have appeared in ordinary life to be normal in every regard. Able, intelligent, friendly people, except for the effect alcohol has on them. He said the other half would have appeared as more or less pronounced neurotic. And it's like that hit me right between the eyes. Because you see, where I got sober in Illinois, and I didn't tell you this part, my first trip was to California. But when I got sober in Illinois, I can tell you that all 7 members of that group that I fell into were Dr. Bob types. They had gotten sober, and after about a year, their life smoothed out just like Dr. Bob's did. And they never had, Dr. Bob reports that he was okay, and he didn't hit a low spot until his wife died. And he loved his wife so much. And when she died, that's when he hit the lowest spot of his sobriety. But he bounced back and he did okay. I don't know about any of you. I'm not like that. I go down, I just keep digging a hole. I just keep going deeper. I don't seem to have any emotional breaks or any governor on the engine of my mind. Relate to that. I had a racing mind. It was like a hamster on a wheel. It never stopped. And you'll also take note that there's an article called The 3 Talks to the Medical Society. It's interesting that New York decided to delete the paragraph I just described to you. I don't know why they did that. But if you read the original 1944 report, New York deleted that paragraph. I'd like to ask them why, but I didn't get a response. I mailed a letter several times. But they deleted the part where Bill said half would be normal, half would be more or less pronounced neurotic, except for the effect alcohol has on them. And I found that because I thought, wait a minute. You mean to tell me that I might just have alcoholism, that I'm like Bill W., and that I've been surrounded with Dr. Bob? There's a that could easily be mocked and made fun of because everybody talks about the garden variety alcoholic. Well, when it comes to just alcohol, I'm a garden variety alcoholic. I have the allergy. I have the obsession, which I will talk about first thing tomorrow. I have the allergy. I have the obsession. There's no doubt about it. But I haven't had a drink. 7 years I hadn't had a drink. So why am I not okay? I'm doing everything I'm being told to do. I'm studying the big book. I'm repeating the big book. I'm doing the steps the best I can out of the big book. I'm not reading any of the other books because I was told not to. And there's a point to me saying that. And so and at 7 years sober, I am 10 times worse now than I've ever been. And I got those 3 diagnoses. And I didn't feel better until I picked up that sack of pills. So I didn't take them. So instead, I went and did this research. And that article led me to even more understanding. And a lot of people don't know this. But then I tracked that down. And here's what else I found. Bill's sponsor was drunk. Roland H. and Ebby T. both got drunk. They've both been drinking. Prior to that, in Iowa for 7 years, in Illinois for 7 years, I never overcame the feeling I'm somehow different, even in AA. I don't understand it. And I forgot to mention this. What I did, my first stop was California. I went there and my sponsor said I should see that Clancy guy. I'd met him when I was 18 days sober as they were coming through Illinois. And so I went to Los Angeles, went down to the Midnight Mission. Ed M., some of you remember Big Ed. Ed was there. He went through my suitcases to make sure I wasn't armed. And then Clancy came out. and I went to his backyard. And that's the first time I've been in a group of people that have personalities like mine, distinctly like mine. I didn't know that at the time. It was just, I relaxed. And if you've ever been to that backyard, it can be intense. And it's the first time I relaxed around other people because I knew I was around people like me. I didn't have that intelligence. I just had the feeling, and I didn't know what to think of it. And so I spent 6 months there, and I went back to Illinois. And then I started that other turn to where I went through Cleveland, Akron, New York, and Vermont. And I knew something was different. I knew that I was the type of an alcoholic that's not like my sponsor, because my sponsor quit drinking and got better. He's an alcoholic. He has the allergy and the obsession. He just doesn't have alcoholism when he's sober. I didn't understand that, folks. He doesn't have alcoholism when he's sober. When he takes a drink, he has alcoholism. You see, and if this confuses you, please come back tomorrow morning because I'm going to straighten that out. I have alcoholism. I had the ism long before I took the first drink. That internal spiritual maladjustment, I didn't know that. I didn't know any of this. And it just sounded crazy when I started finding it, that maybe that's it. Maybe I'm not all these 21 diagnoses I've been given. Maybe I'm just an alcoholic who has alcoholism, and maybe it is a spiritual condition. Maybe all of these things that I'm feeling and doing is about alcoholism and not psychiatry. Because when you have a life like mine, you can become convinced you're psychiatric if you're misinformed or misdiagnosed. And I don't blame the doctors, by the way. I don't blame them. These well-educated men and women, they sit across that desk. That's why they call it the practice of psychiatry, the practice of medicine. They're sitting across the desk from me, and 90% of their diagnosis comes from what I tell them. I didn't have the wherewithal to understand that because I don't want to tell them the truth. They might put me away. So 90% of their diagnosis is from what they hear about me and what I tell them. And I never tell the truth. I'm a chronic pathological liar. I exaggerate, I embellish, I build things up. That's how I was. And so it made sense to me that maybe I was innocently misdiagnosed because of what I told them and what the report from the police department was. And it makes sense. So I don't fault them for that. But what I've come to understand is the ism looks at the symptoms of an internal spiritual maladjustment. For example, take depression. I'll talk more about this tomorrow. I don't want to get into it right now. Take depression. You have to admit, I would have clinical depression surrounding what happened to me at 9 years old. You would have to have clinical depression centered around the brutality of the family. And there's no doubt I had clinical depression from Vietnam. But I got therapy for that, and it resolved that conflict. But after that conflict was resolved, I still felt depressed. I wasn't happy. I didn't know I was engulfed in miles and miles and miles of self-pity. That's the kissing cousin of depression. It looks like depression. I'll talk more about those symptoms tomorrow in case maybe anybody's got that. But now I understand why all those well-meaning people couldn't help me. They were treating me for clinical depression when I was actually suffering from spiritual depression, because that's what Father Dowling diagnosed with Bill Wilson. For example, in 1946, a couple of guys in New York that were kind of fed up with the fact that they blamed Bill for taking Christianity out of AA. They didn't blame Dr. Bob. They blamed Bill W. They felt that Bill wanted what he was actually doing was open it up for the atheists, the agnostics, and those who just don't believe. He wanted it to be open to everybody. But some people were fervent with religion, and they wanted Christianity to stay as our backbone. That's my assessment of it. That's my opinion. Feel free to dismiss it if you like, but that's my opinion. And because Dr. Bob, I don't know if you know this or not, but Dr. Bob was in the Oxford group long before AA ever came into being. He was in the Oxford group 4 years before he met Bill Wilson. They would pray for him, and then he'd go drink. They'd pray for him, then he'd go drink. And so I have an understanding about that I'll talk about tomorrow. And so Bill's got this dilemma. So in 1946, these two guys in New York who had been to Akron and fell into the 6 tenets of the Oxford group and everything that's behind that, the what's now Back to Basics movement, they like that. And so they wrote this book that was published by a company out of Center City, Minnesota. but it was a non-approved. It was not an approved book in AA. These two guys offered it as outside individuals, and it's called The Little Red Book. It's a good book. Don't get me wrong. It's a good book, but it's not an AA book, and it's very religious in its connotation. And a lot of the fellowship got upset about that book because, the only book they had was the big book. And so this book was gaining traction in the meetings. They bringing it to the meeting, reading it in the meetings, and a lot of the fellowship wanted our path to be singular. If you notice in how it works, where it says, we really haven't seen a person fail his 30-hour path, path is not plural. I missed that for a long time, by the way. Path is not plural. So I missed that. And so in 1946, they published that book. It's shown up in meetings. And some of the members came to Bill and asked him to counteract that with a book written by him that would be the essays of the 12 steps, like these two guys wrote these essays and these meditations using a Christian backdrop for it. And Bill basically, I'm paraphrasing, you can find this in the archives in New York if you want to go dig for him. I'll paraphrase. He says, I'm done writing books like that. I'm done. He was so aggravated, as far as I can tell, because he was being gossiped about and condemned even for writing a big book. There are those who said he wrote the big book to make money. There are those who condemned him for writing that book. And then there's those of us that love that book. You know what I mean? And so he wasn't in a big hurry to write any essays on the 12 steps. The 12 traditions were done. This is very interesting. The 12 steps were done. Or the 12 traditions, I beg your pardon. They were basically done, just needed to be approved. And so what happened was Bill's losing his mind. Bill's depression after his white light experience. You know about Bill's white light experience at Towns Hospital. He had a white light experience. And here's something that's interesting too. He had that white light experience at Towns Hospital. And he was in what they called his third treatment at Towns Hospital for alcoholism. And while in his room, he had a white light experience. And you all know that story, how for the next 6 months, he went out to carry the message. He went out trying to find an alcoholic to work with. And all he could think about was that white light experience, removing his obsession to drink. And so for 6 months, he went trying to carry that message, the white light message, to all these alcoholics. None of them got sober. As a matter of fact, Bill talked about one of them committed suicide in his home. He hung himself. And so he came back and he's talking to Dr. Silkworth. He says, Doc, this isn't working. It isn't working. And his wife saved the day. I don't think Al-Anon was there yet. No, it wasn't. Al-Anon wasn't even started yet. Saved our bacon when Bill was grousing about the fact this isn't working. And Lois offhandedly says to Bill, well, you're sober, Bill. Isn't that something? You're sober, Bill. And then he went and visited Dr. Silkworth with that. If it hadn't been for Lois saying that, folks, I don't know where people like me would be right now, if I would be. And so he went and talked to Dr. Silkworth, and he says, Doc, this isn't working. None of them responded. And he reminded him about that guy that committed suicide in his house. He says, what do I do? And Silkworth says, why don't you tell me what you're telling them? And so he listened quietly. And when he got done talking, Dr. Silkworth says, because what Bill said was he was telling him about his white light. Could you imagine being an alcoholic that's drinking and then have someone show up and tell you about a white light experience at Towns Hospital? So he was leading with the spiritual solution without a definitive problem. And Dr. Silkworth says, why don't you wait on that? Why don't you do what I did? Because you see, what Dr. Silkworth believed was after he gave Bill that hopeless description of his plight with an allergy and an obsession to alcohol, when he finally convinced Bill, medically speaking, of the physicality of the malady, that's when Bill had his white light experience. And Dr. Silkworth was of the opinion that Bill wouldn't have had that white light experience had it not been for the desperation created by the hopeless feature of the malady as he presented it to him. So he said, Bill, why don't you go tell them that message? Why don't you tell them what I told you? And then, if they're interested, then present them with the solution that you have. And you know the rest of the story. The very next person he was to meet was Dr. Bob. And isn't it great that he came with that solution instead of the religious one? Dr. Bob already had more religious training than Bill had. Dr. Bob was in the Oxford group. He had great religious training. Bill, he's there, just lost a deal. He just lost a deal. He's busted. He's been parading around Akron. He's pacing the floor at the Mayflower Hotel. Do I drink? Don't I drink? He's listening to the quote, the tinkling of the glasses in the bar. And he's listening to the joviality in the room. I think I paraphrased that. And he goes over that phone, and from what I understand, he made 10 phone calls, and finally on the 10th one, he got a hold of Reverend Walter Tunks. He got through to Henrietta Cyberlane, told her his plight, and she says, "I got one for you." And they worked it out to where Bill and Bob would meet at the Cyberlane State Gatehouse on Mother's Day, 1935. Here's a doctor, drunk on his butt Mother's Day. And here's this bankrupt stock speculator. Could you imagine if he would have come at him with this religious stuff? I can only imagine Bob thinking, because I would have thought it. He already got the God stuff, Bill. Thank you. And that would have ended it. But instead, Bill gave him the description of the hopelessness and the futility of the allergy and the obsession to where it shook Bob to his core. But like many of us, he wasn't done drinking yet. He had to pour booze on the seeds that Bill planted. Some of us got to do that. I can't explain to you why. It's just the way it is. But that's why I'm a firm believer in carrying the message of Alcoholics Anonymous, because they may not get sober right away, but we planted the seed. And they may have to pour some alcohol on it for it to sprout into alcoholism. And that might have been what happened to Bob. We know the rest of the story. Bob got sober on June 10th, 1935. And then the next member was Bill D, number 3. And here we are. But the most important part of that is Dr. Silkworth saying to Bill, why don't you tell him what happened to you? Give him the medical feature, because any picture that leaves out the physical condition, he says, is lacking. Those are my words, not his, or close. I'll read it. I'll read some of it tomorrow. And so here he is. And then, as time goes by, Bill thinks he's fine. His obsession for alcohol has been lifted. And Dr. Bob, he's doing just fabulous. He's standing at the door of Towns Hospital ministering for free, taking in alcoholics for free and working with them. And Bob's emotional nature came back to his normal. And from that day to the day he died, the only real dip he had a natural emotional buoyancy, Dr. Bob did. He just had a natural. He's like my brother. My brother's sober 40 years. I've got 2 years on him. And I never let him forget it, by the way. And, he's a Dr. Bob type. My brother got sober 40 years ago after about a year of going through withdrawals from alcohol, because my brother was a daily drinker, unlike me. I was a periodic. He was a daily drinker. His body had become dependent on alcohol, and so he went through some withdrawal. But after a year, my brother smoothed out. He went to one meeting a week. He still goes to one meeting a week, whether he needs it or not. Sponsors the same 2 guys. He's not motivated to do anything else. He's happy, joyous, and free. Goes to meetings regularly, and it just annoys me. He doesn't understand me, and he seems to have an easier time of it, but that's really not it. It's just his normal mindset is I over E, and mine is E over I to the 10th power. I'll explain more about that tomorrow. And so here comes Bill, 1946. He says, nope. He goes to Father Dowling. Father Dowling has become Bill's spiritual advisor / sponsor. If you ever get a chance, I know this is not an AA approved book, but if you want to really dig into, if you want to hear Father Dowling's side of it, there's a book called The Soul of Sponsorship. Because you see, Bill asked Father Dowling to sponsor him. Father Dowling's a little Jesuit out of St. Louis, as a matter of fact. I think we're in St. Louis now, right? And this little Jesuit saved Bill's life. And by proxy, he saved mine. Because I found the work he did with Bill, I incorporated it. And as days and weeks and months have gone by, I've continued to get better and better and better a day at a time. So what happened was Bill was grousing to Father Dowling, saying, the guys want me to write essays. I don't want to write essays. I don't want to do that. Let's just get the 12 traditions approved. And Father Dowling knew something was wrong with Bill, and he thought he knew what it was. He didn't call it depression. He called it a spiritual malady. That was kind of alluded to in the big book, but is more in depth than the 12 and 12 now, as I understand it. So he asked Father Dowling, will you sponsor me? And Father Dowling saved us from ourselves again. He says, I can't sponsor you, Bill. I'm not an alcoholic. If I sponsor you, that means you'll have doctors and psychiatrists and therapists sponsoring members of AA, and they'll be being paid. And you're going to have a big problem. That should be left to one alcoholic with another alcoholic, as you wrote in your book. And so Father Dowling turned you down. But I can see Bill being an alcoholic like I'm his type. I would have said, after he said, I'll be your spiritual advisor. And Bill said, okay. I can imagine his response. Okay, Spons, thank you. Because that's just how it would have been. And Father Dowling says to Bill, I think I understand your plight. Now, he's a Jesuit, which means they believe God is a gentleman. And he only comes by imitation. So who is he to impose his will? So he was waiting for Bill to ask him for specific help. And he's willing to wait and watch Bill suffer. And he did. He watched Bill suffer emotionally and mentally, knowing he thinks he knows what's wrong with Bill. He believes he knows what's wrong with Bill. And he's waiting for Bill to say, will you help me? But he finally figured out Bill wasn't going to do that. So he waited for an opportunity to come that way. So Bill's grousing to him, whining, complaining how we are. And he says, Ed, I don't know what to do. And Ed interpreted that as asking for help. And so he says, well, I think I know. He says, I think I know what's wrong with you. And Bill says, well, what's that? Now, wouldn't you agree that's a way of asking for help? And so Father Dowling says, I think I know what's wrong with you. He says, I think you're suffering from a thing called spiritual depression. He says, I think you have conscious and unconscious separation from God. He says, and I think if you can fix that, I think the problem will be solved. And God, when I read that, that was news to me. I never heard nothing like that because it's not in our main literature. It's in the history. It's what led up to the book, The Soul of Sponsorship, which is the book I'm talking about with Father Ed. And so he says, I'll tell you what, why don't you take those 12 steps with me? He didn't say work. I'm wrongly stating that. He said, why don't you take those steps with me? And the reason that's important is because I was being a smart guy with my sponsor. And he said, come on, let's take the steps. And I was being a wise guy. And I said, well, where'd they took them? And he said, they took them to heart, you big dummy. And I didn't understand that. Well, Bill had taken the steps to heart. And Father Dowling said to Bill, I think I know what's wrong with you. I think it's spiritual depression. I think you have conscious and unconscious spiritual separation, and I can help you with that. Why don't you take the 12 steps with me? He also knew that most everybody back in those days had only taken the 6 tenets of the Oxford group and were still taking the 6 tenets of the Oxford group. Dr. Bob stuck to the 6 tenets of the Oxford group for a long time because they worked for him and they worked for his crew. But Bill W. was getting worse and worse and worse. He saw the loopholes for the alcoholic embedded in the 6 tenets of the Oxford group. And if you look at those 6 tenets of the Oxford group, they're really good. They are. But they're not enough for an alcoholic of my type with the kind of mind and emotions that I have called alcoholism. And so indeed he did from 1947 to 1949. These are the notes I found. From 1947 to 1949, Bill took the steps with Father Dowling. Now here's Father Dowling, the Jesuit. If you understand Jesuits, they're very academic, educated, always reading, always studying, always learning. And so he took Bill through the 12 steps, but he didn't just take him through. He saw the steps in the big book, and he thought he added 3 components to the steps. They're not in the big book. They're in the 12 and 12. He added 3 components to the step work for Bill specifically. In step 4, in step 8, and in step 10. I'll go over those tomorrow. I don't want to take the time right now. But he added those 3 components to his step work. And from 1947 to 1949, as Bill's taking the steps, Father Dowling didn't rush him through. He had the mind in him. He had a racing mind. His mind raced repeatedly. And he's sober, 13, 14 years, and his mind is still racing. And so Father Dowling knew he couldn't just automatically make Bill's mind stop racing. So what he did was he gave him tools to slow it down. So he's taking the steps with Bill. And he gets to steps 10, 11, and 12. We'll talk more about this tomorrow because that's where the secret sauce is, in my opinion, if you're an alcoholic of my type. And so he's taking the steps 47 and 49. And as he takes him through 1 or 2 of the steps, then he pauses, gives him some time, lets it settle in, observes Bill's reaction to this. And he's writing notes about those observations about Bill. And Bill had worked with Dr. Harry Thibault prior to this. And so if you ever read the Thibault papers, I know they're not AA approved, but you can Google those too. The Thibault papers, he describes, Dr. Thibault does, the infantile mind of the chronic alcoholic in an adult body. It's very fascinating. I'm going to read about that first thing tomorrow morning. And so he's got this going on. And so as he's doing this, get to steps 10, 11, and 12, and Father Dowling has Bill taking steps 10, 11, and 12 in tandem. With those three new components in step 10 that are not in the big book, they're in the 12 and 12. And by taking those on a day-to-day basis and giving him the prayer and meditation that's in the 12 and 12, which I don't want to go into now, I want to go into tomorrow. And what happened was 1949, 1950, Dr. Bob doesn't know what's going on. And by the way, what I'm about to say is not a criticism of Dr. Bob. Please don't leave here and tell people I'm criticizing or dividing between Bill and Bob, because Bill and Bob, from what I can understand, never had an unkind word towards each other at all. But Bob was concerned about this work he was doing with Dr. Tebow and Father Dowling. And he was just concerned. And so he was reminding Bill, even on his deathbed, he said, Bill, let's remember to keep this simple. Let's not louse it up with a bunch of Freudian complexes. I believe Dr. Bob misidentified what he was doing with Father Dowling. It wasn't Freudian work they were doing with Father Dowling. It was the spiritual work that Father Dowling was applying with Bill Wilson. But he did say, let's keep it simple. I believe if Dr. Bob hadn't died in 1950, those essays would have never been published in 1952, because I don't think Bill would have went against Dr. Bob. I really don't believe that. But it's like right after Dr. Bob died. And by the way, when he said, a lot of people don't know this, when he said, remember, Bill, let's keep this thing simple. When he got done with that statement, Bill said, yes, Bob, but let's remember, let's not keep it so simple that we become ineffective. I think that's an important thing to say, because we don't hear that part of it. We only hear about keep it simple. We don't often hear people say, yeah, but let's not keep it so simple we become ineffective. And I'm so glad I found that history in our research. And he also repeated that at two following general service conferences. He actually mentioned, he invoked Dr. Bob's last message, and he invoked that comment. But listen, folks, let's remember, let's not keep it so simple that we become ineffective as a society. Don't you see the profundity of that statement? I believe in keeping it simple. Okay, so Bob was against the essays in the 12 and 12. But here's how, people say Bill wrote those while he was depressed. But what if I told you he didn't write them? What if I suggested Bill didn't actually write the essays, but that Father Dowling did? You see, what he did was he gathered these notes over 2 years, observing Bill's reactions to the step work he took him through. And then he gave those notes to Bill. And what he did was he took those notes and he translated them. Bill wasn't a writer. You don't have to read very far into the big book to realize he wasn't a writer. Bill was a translator, in my opinion. Bill took the best of medicine, psychology, psychiatry, and put it into our language, into I call it Alki-ese. A guy named Mandela said, speak to a man in a language he understands, you get into his head. You speak to a man in his language, you get into his heart. But I'll tell you what, and not just because he's on this meeting, but when I call my sponsor, Tommy doesn't talk to my head. He goes right to my heart because he talks my language. All those other well-meaning experts, God bless them for trying, but they were speaking. I understood what they were saying. For example, when the Navy said, you have to go to treatment and stop drinking, I said, no, I'm not. They said, then you got to go home. I said, all right. I walked away from what I wanted to be a righteous, respectful career. I walked away just so I could keep drinking Budweiser. When my wife said, if you keep drinking, I'm leaving, I went upstairs immediately and packed her bag. You might as well go now. And I wasn't a daily drinker. I just knew the day was going to come. When the psychiatrist said, do not drink alcohol while you're taking this medication, what do you think I did? I quit taking the medication or I went drinking anyway. That's what I did. You see, they got into my head. I understood them. I believed them. I believed I'd be discharged if I didn't go to treatment in the Navy, and I was. I knew my wife would leave me if I kept drinking. I understood everything doctors were saying, but that didn't stop me from drinking. But when William Barney Barnett told me his story, when he took me to my first convention, and I heard Clancy and Johnny and Norm and Chuck and Dottie and Tom Brady from Charlotte, North Carolina do his emotional sobriety talk, they didn't talk to my head. You see, they got right past my head and got me right in the heart. So I understand that thing called language of the heart. And that's what Father Dowling was doing to Bill. You see, Bill didn't write those essays while he's depressed like you hear people put forward. Yes, he was depressed. But Father Dowling gave him the litness of it. Tom Powers came in and helped Bill edit them and put it in a book. And then it was published in 1952. In 1955, we had that special convention at Kiel Auditorium in St. Louis, Missouri. And on July 4th, 1955, Father Dowling informed Bill in 1950, Bill, your problem is you have faulty emotional dependencies you place on people, places, and things to achieve your feelings of self-satisfaction, approval, worthiness, safety, and protection. And you have placed yet another faulty dependency because you're in a faulty dependency on being the founder of AA itself. And I believe you've got to give up AA and become a member. And at that same time, we were wanting to form our own board, and we wanted control of our society. And Bill was afraid to give it up. It's his baby. I could ask any of you women that have a child, you do not want anybody messing with your kid. Your bond with that child is much more intense than mine. And I got to tell you, there's nothing that'll stop me from putting a hurt on somebody trying to hurt one of my children. And my children's mother would be devil dogs if you tried to hurt her kids. And that's just the way it is. I have that same approach to alcohol. That's the bond I had with alcohol. And here Father Dowling is saying to Bill, Bill, you've got to give up AA. This was in late 1949, going on 1950. And of course, they had that convention in 1950. Dr. Bob passed away. And then 1952 rolls around. They published it 12 and 12. And then in 1955, Bill gives up AA. That's something powerful. Bill turned AA over to me and you. And then he later wrote that his depression lifted shortly thereafter. His faulty emotional dependency was broken at last. And in 1956, his depression and anxiety left him until the day he died in 1971. It never returned. I don't know what that does for you, but that motivated me to want to do the exact same thing Bill Wilson did with Father Dowling. And I did. That's what I'll talk about tomorrow in detail. And so I found that information. I took it home with me, shared it with my sponsor, and began to do that work that I'll talk about tomorrow. And what's happened to me, I'll just give you this snapshot. You know, it's been a long time. You know, in 1976, I was court-ordered to take medication for the rest of my life. I'm not going to tell you why, and I'm going to tell you what I did. Some of you know personally, but I wouldn't reveal that at the public level. I still want to have some friends, you know, if I know what I mean. And they let me go in 1976 on that authority. They didn't have the watch guards they've got now. But in 1977, on November 8, 1977, I left my medications in my dumpster. I took my last 3 drinks of alcohol. I began to lose my mind in sobriety. You know people like me, you see them all around. They seem to be crazy. They seem to be riddled with psychiatric diagnoses. But how many of them are really not? How many of them are really Bill W. type alcoholics like me and just don't know? Because I'll tell you, it isn't self-knowledge. What happened was when I did that research and I discovered this, I was so filled with hope. For the first time in my life, I had real hope. And I brought that back to my sponsor. And I remember putting it together. And I knew I was on a new course of action. I didn't know what to do with this, folks. It was like a haberdashery. I don't know how to for sure. And my sponsor, I brought it back, and my sponsor says, well, you know, I'm like that Dr. Bob guy. He kept saying that. He says, I don't need to do that work. I'm good. And I said, well, who am I going to do with them? And he says, well, go find a newcomer. They don't know you haven't done it yet. Just go do it with them. You've done that once before. And I said, okay. And that's exactly what I did. I had formulated some notes for myself. I went and found a newcomer after I'd pretty much put together what I found with Wilson and Tebow and Shoemaker. And I found me a newcomer, and I said, come on, I want to take the steps with you. I led him to believe I already done it, just like my sponsor said. My sponsor said, look, excuse me, let him think you've already taken the steps. Act like you did. And I said, well, I'll try. But, you know, I've been such a phony much of my life that was a piece of cake. So I went and found me a newcomer. And we went through the steps. And it wasn't until after we were done that I actually told him thank you, because that was the first time I'd taken the steps like this, especially with those 3 new components that Father Dowling embraced Bill with, and especially in step 8 that we'll talk about tomorrow. This isn't in the big book, but it's in the 12 and 12, and it's codified in our book, AA Comes of Age. I didn't know that, folks. And so what happened was, I got 5 minutes here. I don't want to go over. We got other people coming. So what happened was, to make a long story short, we took the steps this way. It isn't different than the big book. Trust me, it isn't different. It just has more information in the 12 and 12 that solidified the steps. Bill called the 12-step essays the supplement. Now, I don't have much of an education academically because I was in that special class all through high school. But you guys educated me. I have the finest people in my life as a sponsor, as sponsees. I have educated people, and I'm so grateful because you educated me. I mean, we've got lawyers, doctors. I got a rocket scientist. Andrea, she's in Al-Anon. I don't sponsor her. I'm not in Al-Anon. She has a sponsor, but I mentor her, and she's in her 2nd year of her PhD program at the University of Dundee. She's smart. I'm watching Hamish succeed in business. I see Mark just retired. I see Lawrence starting a new career, a job, and all around me I've got people smarter than me education-wise, and they have taught me. They have brought me into an understanding I never had before, and I'm so grateful that I was in possession of enough desperation to have an open mind, to open it up to the possibilities. And I've been doing that. And just really quick, in 1990. My emotions had begun to straighten out. I was still iffy, but in 1987, I was 10 years sober. I've been doing this, what I call it, the work that Father Dowling did with Wilson, using the big book in the 12 and 12. And at 9.5 years sobriety, I applied to be a police officer, which is impossible to do. If you've been arrested 9 times and you've been psychiatrically institutionalized 17, it's impossible to become a cop unless you live in Iowa. I guess they consider it a good experience. So I became a cop. And in 1990, some guys asked me to do a workshop on that information I found. I immediately said, no, I'm not doing a workshop. I don't know how to do a workshop. Well, they ratted me out to my sponsor because he believes I'm not supposed to say no to a legitimate request for service. I didn't believe that was legitimate. So I said no. My sponsor called me and said yes. I said, okay, yes. So I put together I don't know how to do a workshop. I'm not educated. I don't know how to do that. He said, well, don't be an educated person. Just go do a workshop. Share what you found. And I did. That was 402 workshops ago. And as that workshop going along, and I practiced these principles to the best of my ability, I grew too. And my violence became less. If you expect my violence to end just because you think I should on this, it doesn't happen that way. It would have been nice if it did. I wish I would have been. I can look back and say, gee, I wish I would have known this. You can't know till you know, and you can't do till you do. And now I know. Now I know what I'm afflicted with besides just an alcohol problem. I'm also afflicted with alcoholism. And in my case, it gets worse sober. And I did not know it. I just thought I was an AA loser. And people, by the way, God bless them, they didn't mean any harm. But there were those who pointed out the fact I'm a loser and that I'm running on self-will, which I was. But I didn't understand that self-will is just following behind, not knowing what's wrong with me and what to do about it. Because I'm of the opinion, from my experience, that I am an alcoholic, that I have alcoholism, that in my case, I'm not truly psychiatric. And the evidence of that is little by little by little, as I've taken these actions that I'm going to share about in the next 2 sessions tomorrow, that I truly did suffer from a spiritual malady. That alcohol had this strange ability to seemingly resolve it, albeit temporarily and albeit an illusion. You know, Dr. Silkworth talked about the unusual effect produced by alcohol. He goes on to say it's an illusion. I'd like to talk to him. I would like to sit down face to face and say, now you tell me it's an illusion. Because by God, when I drink Budweiser, I am good looking and I am smart and I'll kick your butt. That's how I would do it if I sat down in front of Dr. Silkworth today. Because it was that real to me. I developed, you know what Father Dowling talked about, faulty emotional dependency. What we have now come to understand is that there's a syndrome, just like Stockholm syndrome. There's a syndrome called faulty emotional dependency, and we can develop that on alcohol. And it becomes a secondary obsession that I didn't know about. And I'm talking to the people that are alcoholic like me, because if you're suffering like this and you're suffering in the quiet of your mind and you're afraid to talk about how you just don't know what's wrong, I'm going to tell you, I now know what's wrong. And it's not wrong anymore. It just is what it is. And I'm going to stop there because my time's up, and I know we got another person coming on in 15 minutes. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning.